You were never supposed to hear this. The documents were buried, the testimonies sealed, and the witnesses silenced. But the truth didn't die. It just waited. Waited beneath the floorboards of a farmhouse in 1834 Virginia, where the screams of 47 children were absorbed by stone walls and never meant to reach your ears. Until now. This isn't folklore. This isn't legend. This is the true story of the Sullivan family and the basement that became a tomb of innocence. In the spring of 1834, beneath a plain white farmhouse in Henrio County, Virginia, Sheriff Benjamin Crawford and his deputy discovered something so unspeakable the reports were hidden for over a century. What they found weren't just victims. They found a system, a method, a machine. 47 children, shackled, starved, broken, whispering a single name, Mother Sullivan. But to understand how this horror remained invisible for over 2 decades, you must first understand how psychological control operates, not just in institutions, but in families, in communities, in the minds of the innocent. The Sullivan home was no house of chaos. It was perfectly ordered, controlled. Every smile, every explanation, every piece of forged correspondence was calculated to bypass suspicion. The neighbors praised her compassion. The pastor offered her blessings, and the town fed the darkness with its silence. She didn't need whips. She used stories. She didn't lock her doors with chains. She used empathy, tradition, and the illusion of care. And you need to understand this. What happened in that basement was not an accident. It was engineered. So the question is not how they hid it for so long. The real question is, how many more Sullivans were there, and how many still are? The house still stands, or at least what's left of it. Rotting beams, a collapsed roof, nature reclaiming what man once used for horror. But if you knew where to look, if you dug just beneath the surface, you'd find the blueprint of madness. You'd find how the Sullivan basement wasn't just a prison. It was a cathedral of control, engineered in silence, stone by stone. Ezra Sullivan didn't just build a cellar, he built a maze, a subterranean hive that stretched far beyond the footprint of the house. The blueprints were never filed. The workers were paid in cash. No questions, no witnesses. Each man brought in to carve one piece of a larger design they could never fully see. That's how this works. Compartmentalization. The same strategy used in secret societies, military black ops, and corrupt institutions. Give each man a task, a piece, a lie, and only those at the top hold the full vision. That's what Constance Sullivan held, a vision. She was not some madwoman overcome with cruelty. No, that would be too easy to explain. She was something far worse, calculated. Every lie was rehearsed, every act of kindness a test, and every child a resource. But the most disturbing part wasn't the chains, or the dark, or even the smell. It was the silence. After the discovery, one deputy wrote in his journal, "They didn't cry. They didn't scream. They just looked at us, as if we were the ones who'd done this." That is what sustained this horror. Not just the cruelty, but the stillness of a community too afraid, too trusting, or too blind to see what was right in front of them. Because sometimes the most dangerous prisons are built in plain sight. To understand how 47 children could disappear and no one asked why, you have to confront a deeper truth, one that's uncomfortable, one that's closer to your own life than you'd like to admit. You see, the Sullivan basement wasn't built with bricks alone. It was built with belief. Constance didn't need guards. She had a doctrine. She created a closed system of reality, a psychological cult buried in domestic routine. And just like any system of control, it operated on 3 pillars: isolation, repetition, and identity manipulation. The children weren't just chained to the walls, they were chained to her voice. Every day, she read to them from her handwritten Book of Mercy, a twisted text she composed herself, part scripture, part commandment, part confession. She told them the world had ended, that their parents had abandoned them, that Mother Sullivan was the only salvation they had left. Over time, some of them believed her. And that's the part most people can't handle, that the human mind, even in a child, can be rewired to love its captor, that when the pain is consistent enough, when the lies are delivered gently enough, the prisoner will defend the prison. That's the real horror. Not the chains, not the basement, but the fact that some of them didn't want to leave. One survivor, interviewed decades later, said this: "She told us the sun would burn our skin, that the air outside was poison, that freedom was a story for fools. And this is the design behind every institution that fears the free mind, control the narrative, starve the body, fracture the will. Then say you're saving them." The Sullivan farm was not just a crime scene, it was a prototype. They called her mother, but what she did to those children was not maternal. It was ritual, it was systematic, it was purposeful. Every Friday, just after sunset, the same event occurred. The children were led one by one into what Ezra Sullivan called the room of reflection. It was smaller than the others. Stone walls, a single chair, a mirror bolted to the far wall. They were made to sit in silence, for hours, staring at their reflection. No food, no water, no words. Just their own emaciated faces under flickering candlelight, while a voice, sometimes Constance's, sometimes Ezra's, whispered through a crack in the stone. "Who are you without us?" Over and over, for hours, until the question dissolved their sense of self. This wasn't discipline. This was identity erasure, because control isn't about violence. It's about confusion. Break the sense of time. Break the trust in memory. Break the ability to know who you are, then rebuild them as tools. Some of those children forgot their real names. They stopped asking for their parents. They began to speak in coded phrases Constance taught them, phrases that mimicked gratitude, obedience, even joy. But none of it was real. It was a defense, a shield the psyche constructs when reality is too unbearable. And here's the part no one wants to talk about. This same system is used in modern institutions. Different tools, same architecture, isolation, surveillance, repetition, and a soft maternal voice telling you that it's all for your own good. So ask yourself, how much of your own identity was chosen, and how much was installed? Because if it happened in a basement in Virginia in 1834, how many other basements have we never found? There was a notebook, leather-bound, hidden beneath a loose stone in the chamber nearest the furnace. On its cover, one word: order. Inside were 212 pages in Constance Sullivan's careful hand. Not a diary, not a confession, a manual. She called it her Doctrine of Shaping. It detailed how long a child could go without food before becoming compliant. How many hours in the dark produced dependency. How to pair pain with reward so they'd beg for punishment, because it meant attention. It wasn't madness. It was science. Primitive, yes, but precise. And this is where the real terror begins. She didn't invent these methods. She documented them, preserved them, passed them on. Pages referenced older texts, ones not found in any local library, European sources, names scribbled in Latin, titles long since banned or burned. The margins were filled with annotations in symbols resembling early Masonic cipher. Constance wasn't just running a prison. She was continuing a lineage. The Sullivan basement wasn't an isolated incident. It was a node, a station in a network of unspoken ideologies, systems obsessed with control, secrecy, and human compliance. And if you think that's a stretch, consider this. Some of the substances found in the basement, herbs, tonics, narcotics, weren't available locally. They were imported, expensive, specific, which raises a question the town of Milbrook never dared ask. Who was supplying her? Because no one runs an operation that large, that long, without protection, without allies, without silence purchased in gold or favors. This was never about one woman's madness. This was about systems that survive by hiding in places no one dares to look. And they always start the same way. With someone calling themselves mother. Milbrook wasn't innocent. They'll tell you they never knew, that they were fooled, that Constance Sullivan spun a web too complex, too clever for the average mind to unravel. But that's not the full truth, because deep down, they did know, or at least they suspected, and they chose to look away. You see, evil rarely hides in shadows. It hides in plain sight, draped in good manners and polite conversation. Constance attended church. She donated food to widows. She held prayer circles on Sundays. And every time someone noticed something strange, a cry at night, a hollow stare from a child, a padlock too thick for farming tools, she gave them what they craved more than truth, plausible deniability. The Sullivans were just private. The children were just shy. The lights at midnight? Just renovations. And the townspeople nodded, smiled, moved on. Because if they looked too closely, they'd have to act. And that would mean confronting something bigger than they were prepared for. So they swallowed their doubts. And in doing so, became part of the machine. This is how institutional horror survives, not by overpowering everyone, but by seducing the many into silence, with comfort, with routine, with the lie that it's not your problem. But it was. One shopkeeper recalled a child staring at him from the wagon, silent, pale, eyes pleading. "I told myself it was my imagination," he said, "that it wasn't what it looked like." But it was. The truth is, monsters don't live in castles. They live next door. They say grace. They buy flour and molasses. They wave to your children and shake your hand. And they survive because most people will trade a lifetime of complicity for 5 seconds of comfort. There was a room deeper than the rest, hidden behind a false wall beyond the last row of shackled children. Even Sheriff Crawford hesitated before entering. They called it the archive. It wasn't large, 12 feet wide, maybe 15 deep, but what it held was older than the house above it, older than Constance, older perhaps than America itself. Shelves lined the stone, each one packed with volumes, leather-bound, hand-stitched, titles etched in Latin, Greek, even Phoenician. There were diagrams, anatomical sketches, charts of lunar phases tied to behavioral cycles, maps with no names, only coordinates and symbols. One book was marked simply, Continuum. Inside were rituals, observations, experiments conducted on children over centuries, passed from one hidden cell to another like sacred knowledge. And this is the moment everything changes. This wasn't just abuse, it was tradition, an underground order camouflaged by the ordinary, using orphanages, asylums, homes for unwanted children as vessels, testing compliance, erasing identity, studying the thresholds of fear and obedience. And each mother was a custodian of this system, trained, initiated, and installed. That's what Constance was. Not a mad woman, not even a leader, a caretaker of the continuum. And if that room existed in Virginia in 1834, then ask yourself, how many other archives are still sealed? How many other caretakers still smile from the porches of unremarkable homes? How many chapters have been written in silence and are waiting for someone to read them? You're not just watching a story. You're touching a thread of something buried but alive. Something that never left. Something that doesn't fear exposure, because most people will choose disbelief over danger. But you didn't. And now the archive is open. By now you understand, this isn't just a story. It's an initiation. You've been brought into something few ever glimpse, and fewer still survive unchanged. Because once you know how the game works, you can never return to the illusion of innocence. So if you've made it this far, you're not like the others. You've crossed the threshold. And now I need you to prove it. Go to the comments right now and type the phrase, "I see through the mother." Type it twice. Not for the algorithm, but to mark the moment you left the surface and began the descent. Because the deeper truth is this: the Sullivan case wasn't just about pain. It was about programming. Every cell in that basement was a lab, a test site, not just for control, but for replacement. The children weren't only being broken, they were being rebuilt. In one recovered document, Constance describes a procedure she called the folding, a process of collapsing identity into obedience, then embedding new core directives using sensory deprivation, narcotic suggestion, and reward-punishment cycles. The goal wasn't submission, it was transformation. To erase the original child and replace them with a vessel, something that looked like a child, but wasn't. One of the survivors, decades later, said this: "By the time she was done, I didn't remember my name, but I remembered hers. I could recite everything she said, word for word. I wasn't me anymore. I was her echo." That's the power of systems like this. They don't just hurt you, they install themselves inside you. So now, look inward. What parts of you were planted by someone else? What voices still whisper when no one's around? I see through the mother. Say it again. And step forward. When authorities excavated the lower chamber weeks after the discovery, they found something no one could explain. 3 child-sized cots in a separate sealed room, untouched by filth, decay, or struggle. Each bed perfectly made. A silver bowl of milk at the foot of one, a hand-carved wooden doll in another, and on the third, a folded note that read, "They are the future." The handwriting matched none of the other Sullivan records. The room was different, clean, sterile, almost reverent, and its contents weren't for containment. They were for preservation. This wasn't punishment. It was curation. For all the torment inflicted on the 47 children, 3 were chosen, conditioned differently, kept apart, not broken, but reshaped. These weren't victims. They were prototypes. The local papers never printed that part of the story. The sheriff's report omits it entirely. But one photograph, discovered in a state archive decades later, shows 3 young figures standing beside Constance Sullivan. Their faces calm, their posture rigid, their eyes vacant. One of those children was traced to a state orphanage in New Jersey, under a different name. She vanished again in 1851, last seen boarding a ship bound for Europe. No record after that. Gone. But the files found beside her bed said more. She had undergone the folding 8 times. Her empathy response had been neutralized. Her obedience index, perfect. What does that mean? It means the Sullivan basement wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. A seeding, a transmission. The creation of vessels designed to carry the doctrine forward, into institutions, churches, governments, bloodlines. Because evil doesn't always die. Sometimes it reproduces. The Sullivan farm was burned to the ground in 1835, just 1 year after the children were freed. Officially, it was a lightning strike. Unofficially, the report is blank. No storm that night, no rainfall, and no survivors in the house when it fell. Constance and Ezra were already gone, taken into custody but vanished in transport. Their wagon was found days later, overturned near Black Hollow Ridge. Blood on the trail. No bodies. The records stop there, but the pattern doesn't. Because in 1837 in Tennessee, a similar orphan home was shut down. 17 children rescued. No explanation in the press. Just a quiet closure and a new fence around the property. In 1842, in upstate New York, same architecture, same sealed basement, same whisper of children calling their captor mother. Coincidence or continuity? Here's what they don't teach you in school. Between 1810 and 1860, over 1,200 children disappeared from state records across 7 eastern states. Most were classified as orphans, runaways, or wards of the church. But in many cases, the paperwork ends abruptly. No foster family, no burial, just gone. And when you compare the dates, locations, and names involved, you start to see it. A network, not always connected by blood, but by doctrine, philosophy, purpose. These were not isolated monsters. These were participants in something older, deeper, and infinitely more dangerous. A belief system rooted in control through suffering, obedience through trauma, and transformation through fear. And every time a case was exposed, it was buried beneath bureaucratic silence. Every sheriff who spoke out was transferred, every file misplaced, every survivor discredited. Because the system doesn't protect children, it protects itself. And if the Sullivan farm was a spark, then what else has been smouldering beneath this country's soil? You want to believe this ended in the 1800s. You want to believe that darkness this deep couldn't survive modern light. But that's the final illusion. Because the system learned, it adapted, it evolved. Today it doesn't wear the face of a woman in a farmhouse. It wears suits, it writes policy. It runs therapeutic boarding schools, behavioral research facilities, and government-funded care institutions. But the model? It's exactly the same. Isolation, repetition, identity collapse, reconstruction. What Constance Sullivan called the folding. Today, they call behavioral correction, trauma recovery, structured living programs. You see it in the forced silence protocols, the reward-punishment matrices, the language engineering where words like freedom and obedience are blurred. One recent report documented a private childcare facility where kids were required to refer to their supervisors as mother unit. Where misbehavior meant time in reflection rooms, the walls padded, the lights dimmed, and a mirror bolted to the far wall. Sound familiar? Because it is. That design didn't die in the Sullivan basement. It was exported into every system that seeks to mold people through control, strip away identity, and rebuild obedient vessels who never question authority. This isn't ancient history. It's a shadow blueprint still coded into the DNA of modern institutions, from childcare to military training to psychological research. The real question is, how many have gone through a system like this without even knowing it? How many children sat alone in rooms, whispering for help that never came, taught that compliance equals love, that silence equals virtue? And how many of those children grew up, never realizing they were shaped? Look around. How many adults do you see who behave like echoes? You think this is about the past? It's not. It's about programming. And the truth is brutal. A broken child becomes a controlled adult. This is what they knew in the Sullivan basement. What Constance etched into every page of the Doctrine of Shaping, that you don't need bars to build a prison. You just need shame, confusion, repetition. Break the will early, and the body follows for life. Look around this country. How many men walk with slumped shoulders, unsure of their voice? How many women apologize for taking up space? How many adults carry memories they can't place, but feel in their bones when the door slams or the lights go out? The Sullivan children weren't the only ones folded. We were all folded, just in quieter ways. Through institutions that taught obedience over intuition, through religions that preached guilt before grace, through classrooms that punished questions and rewarded silence, through families that passed down fear as if it were wisdom. This is how the doctrine spreads, not just in basements but in policies, pulpits and playgrounds. And it costs more than you realize, because the children chained in that basement, they weren't just tortured, they were studied. Their reactions, their screams, their breaking points. Every moment was documented, used to refine the machine, a machine that still hums today beneath the surface of power. And every time you hesitate to speak, every time you feel small in the face of authority, every time you tell yourself, "This is just how the world works," you are hearing the echo of that doctrine. So ask yourself, what part of your soul was taken before you knew it had value? And more importantly, who benefits from you never getting it back? The basement was discovered. The children were removed. The story ends there. Right? Wrong. Because liberation isn't rescue, not when the programming is still intact. 47 children were pulled from that cellar in 1834. 47 blank stares. 47 fractured minds. But no therapy, no reintegration, no understanding of what had been done to them. They weren't healed. They were dispersed. Sent to orphanages, workhouses, Christian homes for recovery. Each one a new institution with its own rules, its own dogma, its own quiet methods of control. And guess what? Most of them disappeared again. Not physically, bureaucratically, psychologically. Their names changed, their files sealed, their memories blurred. Some became mute, others violent. Some joined the very systems that broke them, becoming caretakers, wardens, priests. Because trauma doesn't just shatter the mind, it replicates. One boy, originally listed as Subject 19, was later found running a reform school in Ohio. His records show he implemented solitary confinement for boys as young as 6. Another, Subject 03, a girl named Ruth, was institutionalized for schizophrenia in 1847. She spoke only in prayers, and sometimes in phrases directly lifted from Constance Sullivan's journals, word for word. These weren't isolated tragedies. They were continuations. Because when a system is built to erase identity, it doesn't end when the door opens. It ends when the programming is undone, and no one taught these children how to undo it. So they became echoes. Some walked into silence, others into madness, a few into power. And this is the part no one wants to face. The victims of one generation often become the architects of the next. That's how the doctrine survives, not through blood, through trauma, through unhealed pain that seeks control to feel safe. And if no one intervenes, it grows, it mutates, and it builds new basements. There's a reason they never prosecuted Constance Sullivan, a reason the sheriff's report vanished, a reason the judge sealed the case, a reason none of it made the national press. Because the people at the top already knew. They weren't shocked. They weren't outraged. They were informed. And that's the final layer you need to understand. This wasn't a crime. It was a protected operation. Constance wasn't acting alone. She was placed there, positioned, trained. We now know she traveled to Europe in 1821, just 13 years before the Virginia arrests. Her passport was sponsored by a private foundation connected to early behavioral science, a group that believed obedience could be engineered through trauma and ritual. She returned fluent in German, Latin, and French. Her journals began to include diagrams of soul fracturing, mirrored pain response, and identity displacement through maternal inversion. This was not the work of a madwoman. It was the work of a programmer. And the Sullivan basement? That was her laboratory. A proof of concept. When they found the bodies, when the public cried for justice, someone higher up made a decision. Protect the asset. Because what she discovered was useful. Imagine the power of a child raised to obey without hesitation, to suppress fear, to forget pain, to kill conscience. That's not a tragedy to these people. That's a technology. And once it worked, they didn't shut it down. They expanded it. Across continents, across wars, across classrooms and churches and clinics. The names change, the uniforms change, the paperwork improves. But the doctrine? It's still operational. And if you think this is some gothic ghost story buried in the 1800s, look closer. At the silence in the systems around you, at the way some children still vanish, at the way authority still demands love instead of truth. The Sullivan file isn't closed. It was archived. By now, you've seen the pattern, the silence, the disappearance, the ritual. But there's one last piece. The seed. Buried inside every child in that basement was a single phrase, repeated again and again until it etched itself beneath language. The mother loves, the mother shapes, the mother decides. It was their prayer, their anchor, their leash. Some survivors were found whispering it in sleep. Others carved it into wood, walls, even their own skin. Not because they believed it, but because they'd been programmed to need it. That's the real horror. Not the chains, the dependence. Because once you convince a child that pain is love, that silence is safety, that obedience is identity, you don't need to imprison them. They'll police themselves, and they'll pass it on. This is what the doctrine always wanted. Not control over bodies, but control over belief. To install a framework that would persist even without the architect. Constance didn't care if she died. She knew the seed would survive. In every child who couldn't scream, in every adult who flinched at freedom, in every institution that said, it's for your own good. So ask yourself, how many of your beliefs were planted by someone who needed you obedient? Who taught you to fear your own power? Who convinced you that love had to be earned through sacrifice? Because the Sullivan children are gone. But the programming, it's in our schools, our homes, our laws. It's in every part of society that teaches compliance before conscience. That makes you ask permission, just to breathe. The doctrine was never about the past. It was about legacy. And now that you see it, what will you do? You followed the trail, through the filth, the doctrine, the silence. But now it's time to face the final horror. The basement never ended. It just got bigger. What was once beneath a farmhouse in Virginia is now woven into institutions, ideologies, even your own family. The tools evolved, but the aim never changed. To fracture, to fold, to own. And you, sitting there, watching this, you were never untouched. Because somewhere along the way, you were told to be quiet when you wanted to scream, to sit still when you wanted to run, to smile when something in your soul was dying. That's the new chain. The invisible one. The one that tells you to adapt instead of rebel. But here's the truth. They never wanted you to hear. You are not broken. You were broken. And that difference matters. Because anything that's been broken can be rebuilt. Not into who you were, into who you were always meant to be, before the folding, before the silence, before they inserted fear where your fire should have been. This isn't just a story about children in chains. It's about you, the child inside you that still obeys, the voice you buried to survive, the parts of yourself you sacrificed to feel safe. It's time to go back and get them, because the greatest act of rebellion is not escape. It's restoration. To speak again, to remember, to rebuild a mind they tried to erase. The Sullivan family thought they could shape the future in a basement. They were wrong. The future is shaped by those who step out of that darkness and refuse to pass it on. So here's the final question. When they write about you, will they say you were folded? Or will they say, you broke the doctrine and set the fire and burned the system to ash?